Hey everybody, hope you're having a great day today. We're going to start out this semester with a little bit of a review, and we are going to just kind of do some basic review, and this is really just to make sure that you guys feel comfortable coming into this class and with an understanding of things that you should have a little bit of knowledge about, be it 210 or 211. About halfway through um, this presentation, I'm going to mention that if you're in 210, then that's going to be the end of the review for you. But if you're in 211, then we're going to continue reviewing. And so about halfway through, once we get to information, especially about tissues, then that's whenever we're going to start. And some of the cellular stuff, then that's whenever we're going to start to kind of move on into 211 review, and that's going to cover material that you should have had in 210. So again, once we get to the levels of organization and we get towards the middle of those levels, towards the cellular and the tissue level, then listen for me if you're in 210, and you can go ahead and turn the presentation off. But if you're in 211, then you can just keep on listening, and we will wrap up and mention some of the things that you should have remembered back from 210. All right, so just an introduction. Don't forget, biology is what this class is about. So we are in a biology class. So biology is the study of life. And so bio, of course, meaning life, and ology being the suffix for study of. So what exactly does it mean to be living? And I think a lot of times people have never really heard this or never thought about this very much, but what does it mean to be alive versus non-living? And so there, depending on which source you're dealing with, there's different qualifications, characteristics that qualify something for being alive. Here, we're going to mention 6 different things that a structure must have in order to be considered living. And so you can see these 6 characteristics here. Again, this is not going to be on the test. This is just a review. It's just kind of something to think about to begin with here. First off, all living things must be organized. We're about to talk about this levels of organization, and that's where we're going to spend most of our time on this review. And so I'm sure that you're aware that we start out as atoms. We build those atoms into molecules. Those molecules build cells. Cells build tissues. Tissues build organs. And then organs build systems. And so that's a very organized pattern of arrangement. And so living things must be organized. We are organized as far as this different level, but even some of the smaller things that are living are still kind of organized like this. They're made of chemicals and atoms. They're made of molecules that's creating their cells. And so the cell is kind of that smallest living structure. In order to be alive, you must be responsive. So you must respond to some sort of stimulus, and it may not be the same stimulus that something else responds to, but as long as you are responsive to a stimulus, then you are considered to be, that's one of the characteristics of considered to be living. So we respond to many different things. We respond to sounds and sights and smells, and so we have a lot of different sensory inputs that we can respond to. Even things like, plants, they respond to sunlight, they respond to water in the ground. A fungus is the other major living organisms on our planet, animals and plants, and then fungus. And then we start to get even smaller from there. But even fungus responds to food. It grows towards a food source, a rotting food source. So responsiveness, what does it mean to be living? And this is something that you have is to respond to some stimuli. You have to grow and differentiate. So you start out smaller, and then as you get bigger, you're going to add to the organization, and then you're going to start to diversify that. You're going to start to become different. So for example, we start out as one cell. When that spermatozoa, and the secondary oocyte unite, there at fertilization, then we create the very first cell that we ever were, and that's called a zygote, right? And so that zygote then starts to grow rapidly. And it's now today, as an adult, you're approximately 75 trillion cells. That's some like super huge Dr. Evil kind of numbers. So we're talking trillions of cells. You have grown from one zygote into approximately 75 trillion cells. But the key is each one of those cells is not the same. We've we're made up of hundreds of different cell types. And so these different cell types each do something different. And that's what differentiation is not only do we grow and we add to our cells or our tissues, but each of these cells or groups of cells are going to act differently, and they're going to provide different types of function. And this is important. With all these different functions working together gives us that balance that keeps us living and keeps us, kind of going, and proves that we are alive. The next thing is reproduction. So living things must reproduce. Obviously, thinking about human reproduction, we think about sexual reproduction, and so we think about two different partners. We can have two like partners that can get married and could adopt a kid, but they can't physically have a kid, and so these partners must be different. A lot of times in science and biology, we don't talk about male versus female. A lot of times we even just make it simpler and talk about plus versus minus, just to show that there is this difference, that without the plus and the minus, then you're not going to create this next generation. So we need that human spermatozoa and that secondary oocyte together to create that sexual reproduction, create that next generation. So other animals, though, like a cell, I mentioned just a second ago that a cell by itself is the smallest living structure. And so if a single-celled organ simply splits, makes a copy of itself, then that is referred to as asexual reproduction. So that is the most common form of asexual reproduction that we think about. Yeast, for example, reproduce by budding, and so they simply just bubble off a different cell off of that yeast cell. And it's very similar. Our cells reproduce as well. We have stem cells that reproduce and create brand new cells inside of our body. And so we have a similar component to that inside of our body. But if you were single-celled, you would refer to that as asexual reproduction. But of course, we're more familiar with sexual reproduction being humans. Movement. All living things must move. They must move towards something, away from something. So they have to move, some sort of movement. Again, we have movement inside and outside of our body. Our heart pumps our blood inside, and our muscles move us around on the outside. And so we exhibit several different forms of movement. Plants don't have muscles, but they still exhibit movement. So we've talked about how plants respond to sunlight and they respond to water. So they can even move their stems, depending on the plant. They can move it over a foot if the water source is not good. And then that way they can just kind of move towards that water source. The Again, fungus moves towards food. And so, there are some different forms of movement. The last characteristic is something that I definitely want you to take a note about. And so this is metabolism. So I definitely want you to take a note about this metabolism. First off, metabolism, a good definition is any chemical reaction in the body. Okay, so write that down. Any chemical reaction in the body. So a lot of times people will say that metabolism is the sum of all chemical reactions in the body, but it makes it sound like if we don't add them all up, then we're not really experiencing metabolism. A lot of times you ask somebody what is metabolism, they're going to tell you, burning food, making energy, these kind of things. Well, that's true, but there's all sorts of types of metabolism, and that's not it. To just singularly say that it's dealing with food and calories and energy is not a good thing. That's not correct. So anytime we build something in our body, that's also a type of metabolism. So not just breaking down to get energy, but building new things. Whenever we eat, we're going to use those nutrients to build hormones, to build neurotransmitters, to build muscle. And so building these structures is another form of metabolism. So if you undergo chemistry inside different from outside, then that is a characteristic of being living. And to be quite honest with you, that is the main thing that creates structurally kind of a living organism. If you can set a boundary like a cell membrane, and on the inside of that cell you can do something different compared to the outside of that cell, you can do chemistry different inside compared to the chemistry that's going on outside, then you've just created life because you've created metabolism inside of that cell. So metabolism is a very important term. any chemical reaction in the body, and we're going to talk about this over and over and over, both in 210 and 211. Real quick, let's talk briefly about anatomy and physiology itself. This is something that you've heard over and over again, so I don't want to harp on this too long. First off, both of these are subspecialties of biology. Anatomy is dealing with structure or the parts of the body, and physiology is dealing with the function or how those parts work. And so, anatomy, many times we divide it into microscopic versus macroscopic anatomy. Microscopic, we need to use a microscope. That's not too tough. You could probably figure that out. Macroscopic, we can see it without a microscope. So we say sometimes our unaided or our naked eye is what we can use to see those. And so anatomy is going to talk about the part. Anatomy is what we do in lab mostly. So lab is traditionally for an anatomy and physiology class is the anatomy. It is learning parts. We're going to learn in 210 the parts of the skeleton, the bones and all those structures on the bones. So that's going to be something major. And then in 211, we're going to learn, for example, all the components of the heart and the blood vessels for the cardiovascular. And so there we can see some of these different types of topics that we're going to cover for anatomy in both 210 and 211. So anatomy is more lab, and physiology, the function, is more lecture. And so this is why in this course the anatomy part tends to be a lot easier compared to the physiology part. The lab tends to be easier than the lecture for most people, probably 90%. Some people it's backwards, and that's okay. But the key is that it's easier most of the time to learn the name of a part than to understand how that part works. For you to open the hood of your car and to point and say, that's an engine, is a whole lot easier than describing how that engine actually works. And so a lot of times the lab is going to be an easier component of this class. And there you're going to be able to make up some of your points. You're going to be able to get higher in lab because you're probably not going to do as well in lecture because, again, telling somebody how something functions is a lot harder than telling them simply what that thing is, And so the lecture component, the lecture tests tend to be more complicated here in this class. Again, we can use that word physiology and we attach it to just about anything. And it's going to describe how that thing functions. So cell physiology is telling us how does the cell function. Systemic physiology, how does a system function? And that tends to be a lot of what we do here. We talk about how the cells and how the tissues function together to create the entire system's physiology. We tend to take this class as a group of organ systems. So again, in 210, we're going to start with some basics. We're going to learn up to the tissues, but then we're going to start systems. We're going to do skeletal system, then we're going to do the integumentary system, then we're going to do the muscular system, and then we're going to do the nervous system. And in 211, we start with endocrine, and then we go into cardiovascular, immunity, respiratory, digestion, urinary, and reproduction. And so we're going to look through all of these different systemic physiologies as we go. And then many times, if the system is too big, then we're going to have individual chapters about specifics in that system. So a lot of times a whole system is just one chapter, but many times it may take up 2 or 3 chapters. Nervous physiology is going to take up chapters 12 through 16. So 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 5 chapters just for nervous. But then we look at something like respiratory, and that only takes up 1 chapter. So this class tends to focus more, again, during the lecture on the physiology, the function, and we tend to focus a lot of times on the system, and then we start to break it down and look at the components of that system. Now, it just kind of makes sense that you can't really separate form and function. Okay, if there is a structure, then it usually, almost always, performs a function. And if there's a function in the body, then there is a structure that's going to perform it. So anatomy and physiology are always connected. It's really hard to separate these two. It's very important, in my opinion, if you're going to take these classes, you take 210 and 211. You don't take 215 and 216. 215 is anatomy, 216 is physiology. It's hard to separate those. You're really trying to separate something that doesn't want to be separated. Trying to take the eggs out of a cake that's already made is not an easy thing to do, right? You can't do it. And so that's kind of the way it works. Now, again, most structures have functions. Things like our appendix, we know it's non-functional, but we still have it. That's the reason it can become infected and you can have appendicitis. But it actually doesn't have any functions. We've kind of evolved past using that as a function. All right. Now, let's get into the real meat of today's review, and that's dealing with these levels of organization. And again, this is where we're going to spend the rest of our time here with the review. And somewhere down through the middle of this, whenever we get towards the cellular levels, I will mention that this is a good time for 210ers to cut it off and for the 211 folks to keep paying attention. All right. So first off, let's start with this chemical level. And I think it's good for you to take notes while we're doing this, just to kind of get in the practice of how are we going to do this, online or in class, either way. And so I think it's good for you to take notes. So right now you should probably write down this entire slide, levels of organization, and then microscopic to macro, and then list all these different levels. Okay, so go ahead and write that down. I'll give you a little bit to write that down, and then we're going to cover each one of these components individually and kind of give more details. So I'll give you another minute or two. Just jot this down. Don't leave blanks. Just list it as a big list. Your brain, when you're learning, it likes to see lists. If you take a list and you expand it and you put too much information out beside each thing, then your brain doesn't want to learn that as easily. So it's good to have this list first. And then underneath the list, we can take each one of these components and kind of break it down. All right, so hopefully you've got that list written down. Now underneath there, let's go ahead and let's write chemical, right? So we're going to start with that number one level, the chemical level. When we look at chemicals, obviously here we could also refer to this as the atomic level. Okay, so in this level we're looking at atoms. So that's the most important term to attach to the chemical level is going to be atoms. I want you to know a good definition for an atom. Okay, an atom is the smallest stable unit of matter. So an atom, again, is the smallest stable unit of matter. If we take anything on our planet and we break it down into its components, the smallest thing that won't break down on its own is going to be an atom. If we have an atom sitting on a table in front of you, then it's not going to break down into its protons and neutrons and electrons. Those are always going to stay together. We have to really manipulate those to rip them apart. And that's what happens in nuclear fusion, right? So, and that's nuclear power. So when we talk about this chemical reaction, we're looking at these atoms. Now, when we talk about atoms, I just mentioned, we've got protons and neutrons, and those tend to be in the atomic nucleus. They tend to be there in the central region, kind of the core of that atom. And rotating around that core, that atomic nucleus of protons and neutrons, are going to be the electrons. Now, the protons are going to have a positive charge. So each proton gives us a plus charge. Each neutron is a neutral charge. So that doesn't really affect us as far as a charge, okay, as far as kind of attraction. And charges, think about magnets even sometimes. And so the positives, protons, must also equal the negatives, or else you're going to have an atom that's out of whack. You're going to have something else, okay? An atom with a different amount of electrons or protons is going to change that atom. So the key here, the number of protons, they're positive, and the electrons are going to have a negative charge. And so if we have 5 protons, then in order to be balanced, then this atom must also have 5 electrons. And so whenever we look at the protons and we look at the electrons, if you've studied any chemistry before, then you know that the protons and the neutrons are in that nucleus. The electrons are orbiting. The electrons can be given away or they can be accepted, right? But you've never heard of protons being given away or accepted. And so if we're going to manipulate any part of this atom, then we're going to be dealing with the electrons. But the protons are the pluses that determine how many electrons we have. So in reality, the protons of an atom, the number of protons specifically, is what gives that atom its properties. And many times when we talk about its properties, we talk about how it can bind with other atoms. And again, when we talk about binding with other atoms, we're talking about giving up, accepting, or sharing electrons. And so to build these molecules, we've got to move these electrons to and fro, but we can't move these protons. So again, the protons are what give these atoms their specific abilities, their abilities to bind, because the number of protons truly equals the number of electrons. And there's your functional component. So when we look at this, all of the atoms that have the same number of protons always act the same, right? So we group all atoms that have the same number of protons, and we call all of those one element. So I want you to jot that down. An element, it is a group of atoms, each with the same number of protons. So again, it's a group of atoms, and each one of these atoms has the same number of protons. So that means they have the same electrons, and they're going to react the same. So an element is really just a group of atoms that are going to react the same. Okay? And what determines that is their proton number. And we call that the atomic number eventually. Now, that's for chemistry. That's a little bit more for chemistry class. We don't have to get too much detail dealing with that. And we will talk more about this chemistry when we get into our first chapter or second chapter here for Bio 210. All right. Now, the key here is we've already talked about that we've got an atom and we've got a element. Now, if we start to do something with these electrons, then we can build a molecule. So I want you to move on and let's talk about this second level. So let's start a new note dealing with molecules. And a good definition of a molecule is two or more atoms bound together. So a molecule is two or more atoms that are bound together. And again, how do they bind? With electrons. So let's talk about that. I've mentioned just a second ago that these atoms, they can either share their electrons. So I want you to know that if atoms are sharing electrons, we call that covalent. C-O-V-A-L-E-N-T. Covalent. So covalent molecules are sharing their electrons. Now again, the whole key here is that on the outer shell of these atoms, we stick to this thing called the octet rule. Now again, if you're in 210, we're going to hit this stuff for our first test, so we're going to review a lot of this, but this is some stuff you should somewhat be familiar with. So the octet rule says that there needs to be 8 electrons in the outer shell of an atom in order for it to be happy. And so in order for it to be stable. If not, it's very reactive, right? And highly reactive atoms are bad. They can cause bad reactions. And so in order to make these atoms stable, they're going to have a certain number of electrons in their outer shell. And the atom itself, remember, has the same pluses and minuses, so it's kind of balanced. But in order to balance all these atoms around each other, they are going to bind in order to meet that octet rule. So if two atoms can bind together and both of them then have 8 electrons in their outer shell, then they're just going to share those electrons. They're just going to hang out really close together. They're going to be bound by that sharing ability, and we're going to call that a covalent bond. Now, the other way to do this is called an ionic bond. And let's take down that definition real quick. An ion, I-O-N, ion is a charged atom. In other words, it's an atom with a charge. Now, we said it just a second ago that the only way to change the charge on this atom, because we can't give away or accept protons, is to give away or accept electrons. Now, we mentioned that the electron has a negative charge. So if I have 1 electron in my outer shell, then I can give that away and drop down to my next shell, and that will have 8 in it. And so if I give away an electron, if I take away a negative, then that makes me become positive. So if one atom gives away an electron, it becomes positive. Okay? Now, if another atom accepts that electron, it gains that negative, well, then that atom is going to become negative. And so when we're looking at this, these two atoms now have a plus and a minus charge. And so the positively charged atom is now called the cation. Okay, so the cation is the positively charged, and the anion is the negatively charged. And so now this cation and this anion, it's really just cation and then anion. So this cation and anion, the cat has the plus and the an has the minus. Now they're attracted just like magnets. So now these guys are going to stick together because of charges. So this is what's called an ionic bond, is when two ions are bonding because they are attracted based on their charge. Again, covalent shares, and ionic is giving up or accepting, and then there becomes an attraction. Now, most of those ionic bonds are going to form salts and form some of our other things, but the covalent bonds start to really form some of our very important molecules. And these molecules are our organic molecules. Now, these are also called biological molecules or biomolecules in our textbook. And again, if you're in 210, we're going to hit this in our chapter. And if you're in 211, you should know this already. There are 4 organic molecules, okay? Well, excuse me, before we get to the 4 organics, let's talk about the difference between organic and inorganic real quick. All right, so let's review that. Organic, in order to be an organic molecule, then you are going to have 3 specific atoms, 3 specific elements. And you can have, more elements, but you have to have at least carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen, CH and O. If you have CH and O, then that molecule is considered to be an organic molecule. And the word organic implies that it can build life. It can create life. These molecules can get together and build life, make a living structure. So cells are built out of organic molecules. Humans are built out of organic molecules. Now the inorganic molecules, they're missing one of those. They don't have CH and O. Okay, so carbon dioxide, CO2. Well, that's an inorganic molecule. Okay, H2O, it's missing the carbon. So that's an inorganic molecule. O2, again, it's missing the carbon and the hydrogen. So that's an inorganic molecule. But I just pointed out water, oxygen. Are those important? Heck yeah, they are, right? So these inorganic molecules, just because they can't build life doesn't mean that they're not important. Inorganic molecules help to maintain life, like oxygen and water. So these things are still important. But when we talk about most anatomy and physiology, we're usually talking about the organic molecules. We're talking about the living structures and how they're interacting. So let's focus now on those 4 groups of organic molecules. The 4 groups of organic molecules, again, organics build life. They're made out of carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen, and then others. The 4 are, go ahead and write them down, carbohydrates, lipids, proteins, and nucleic acids. So again, carbohydrates, lipids, proteins, and nucleic acids. Now, let's take a little bit of time and let's cover each one of these. Now, once we get finished with this, I'll give you a definition of a tissue, and then I'll let the 210ers go, and then the 211ers will hang on with us, okay? Now, the 4 organic molecules, again, let's start with carbohydrates. So number 1, let's take some notes on carbohydrates. First off, carbohydrates are important for energy. Okay, carbohydrate, it's got carbon and it's got hydrate, it's got water. So it's CH2O. If you looked at the equation, then it's going to be C, 2 H's, and 1 O. So 1 C, 2 H's, 1 O. So that's really how it's got its name. Now these guys are important for energy, right? And if you're an active individual, then you should eat 2/3 or so of your diet in carbohydrates, because we need energy every day in order to function properly. But again, if you eat too many carbohydrates, then they're going to become stored as fat, And that's the bad thing. So a lot of times people say carbs are bad for you, and those people don't really know what they're talking about. Carbohydrates are important for you to function properly. So you need to eat carbohydrates, but the point is, if you don't burn them by the end of the day, they're going to become lipids. They're going to become adipose and fat, and that's not a good thing. So these carbohydrates, I've got two groups of them. We've got monosaccharides as the building blocks. So I want you to know that monosaccharides, monosaccharides, monosaccharide, two C's and an H there. These are the simplest sugars. Okay, so these are our simple sugars, and these are the building blocks of carbohydrates. All bigger carbs are made out of these. Okay, so if a carbohydrate's a beaded necklace, then each bead is one monosaccharide. Now, once we get bigger, we can talk about disaccharides and trisaccharides as two or three of these linked together, but we tend to just go straight towards polysaccharides as our second major type. So we've got these monosaccharides that are the building blocks. And again, the best example of a monosaccharide is one that you've got to get used to, and that is glucose. So glucose, C6H12O6. Again, we've got the same amount of carbon and oxygen and twice as much hydrogen. So C6H12O6 is glucose, and that's the primary sugar that our body runs on. So again, our engines like a specific type of gas, and that is glucose. Whatever we put in, we tend to break it down and convert it into glucose in order to make our engines run, make our cells run. And so glucose is the primary monosaccharide that we're going to talk about. There's going to be others, but that's the main one that you'll hear. Now, these polysaccharides, these guys are going to be bigger carbohydrates. Sometimes we call these complex carbohydrates, and you may have heard of that term before. So complex carbohydrates, sometimes if you eat those, we refer to those also as starches, right? So if you eat starches, these complex carbs, what it is, bread and pasta and things like that, these are actually long chains of these monosaccharides. So these complex carbs are not there for quick, immediate energy, but because they're long chains of it, it's more kind of like a little bit of stored energy, right? And so if you eat a bunch of simple sugars, then you're going to burn through them fairly quickly. But if you eat more complex carbohydrates, then they're going to burn slowly through your body. And so that's a good thing. You know, we don't want to eat a bunch of Jolly Ranchers. If we're going to eat carbs, we should eat things a little bit more starchy so that they can slowly break down through the day and give us that energy that we need, right? Now, that's it for carbohydrates for now. They're energy. Building blocks are monosaccharides, and glucose is that main one. The next thing that we mentioned are lipids. So let's go to that. Lipids. Most people immediately think about fat, but let's don't forget that also oils are types of lipids. So lipids are fats and oils. Now, if we talk about those two, think about who tends to make fat and who tends to make oil. If you go to a supermarket and try to buy oil, what kind of things are you going to get oil made from? So if you think about it, you're going to realize that oil tends to come more from plants, right? And fats tend to come more from animals. And so that's kind of a major difference between these lipids is fats are mainly animal-based and oils are mainly plant-based. Now, let's think about this also. At room temperature, which one is solid and which one is liquid? So in the grocery store, which one is solid? The fat on that steak in the meat department, or the oil over there in that olive oil container, right? So the fat is solid at room temp and oil is not. So in our body, it heats up to 98.6 and it all melts. But again, which ones are going to be better? Which ones are going to be more fluid and flow through our body better and not clog things, fats or oils? Again, it makes sense that these oils from these plants are going to be better for us than the fats from the animals. And so again, if you're thinking about your diet, I know some of these people are on these low carb keto diets, and this is definitely not the best thing because if you're trying to load up on fat, usually that's going to be a bad thing. That cholesterol goes up, you start to clog those arteries. Who cares if you've lost weight? You haven't lost fat. You've gained fat, and now you're actually got too much fat in your body, and you're going to have a heart attack or a stroke because of increased fat levels. So you've got to be real careful with a lot of these fad diets. If it's a fad diet, then you shouldn't shouldn't be on it. The only diet you should focus on is a balanced diet, and then you need to be active, right? So that's the two things: eat balanced and then be active. So these lipids, the building blocks of lipids, are called fatty acids. So these fatty acids, these things can build up, and in most critters, in most creatures, in most plants, then we talk about fatty acids. But our body is kind of unique. It doesn't really want to eat fat. And so it has to create a form that it can absorb into our body, and it absorbs it in the form of a triglyceride. And we'll talk about this in 211. But it absorbs fat as a triglyceride through our intestines, and then in our bloodstream, we tend to carry fat in the form of triglycerides. So I definitely want you to know that the main building block in our body of fat are going to be triglycerides overall. So either fatty acids or triglycerides are the building blocks. Now, these fats, a lot of times people talk about it, and I mentioned it before. If you eat too many carbs and you don't burn them, well, then you're going to store them in the form of fat. And so fat is a form of stored energy. The big problem is, I don't know about you, but I just keep storing this stuff. I don't really unlock it, right? We don't go through a hard winter where we're going to be without food forever, and we're going to deflate those adipose cells. And so we don't really put ourselves through the natural selective processes that nature truly has created our bodies upon. And so because we have access to so much food in these lean times, whenever it's cold out, you usually couldn't go find a berry on a bush or an apple on a tree, or meat grazing. That's usually happening in the warmer weather. And so during the winter, we should be relying on our fat, and that's the problem. Think about it. Whenever you're trying to lose weight, we have evolved to lose weight slowly, because we don't want to lose that weight very quickly. We want to lose it slowly over the winter, so that we don't just desiccate and die. But then once we hit spring and we see some food and we start to eat, we want our bodies to bulk back up very quickly. And that's the problem. It takes forever to try to lose weight. But then as soon as you change your habits, you've lost some weight and you've changed your habits, as long as you have those adipose cells still in your body, which the only way to get them out is through liposuction, then you're going to simply reinflate those adipocytes, and then you're going to gain that weight back so rapidly. So that's the problem with weight loss, is you have to make permanent changes to your diet and your exercise regimen. Because if you simply just go on a fad diet, a keto diet for a while, you lose some weight, and then you stop and you get back eating normal, then you're just going to regain all that weight very quickly. It takes a long time to lose it through the winter, but very quick to gain it in the spring. Okay. Now, protein. Protein's the next thing. And so, well, actually, hold on. We're not finished. So, back with adipose, back with lipids, function. I mentioned long-term stored energy, but the main function that I definitely want you to make a note about here for our class is adipose in our body tends to be more for protection. Okay, it tends to be more for insulation and for protection and for cushioning, right? So let's think about it in a positive light. So think about it on your butt. Whenever you sit down, we need a lot of cushioning there. You've got those bones that can start to kind of hurt. If you sit on your butt bones too long, you start to feel some real pain. So we need some padding down there, for example. We've only got 3 positions that we mainly are in, standing, sitting, or laying down. So it's important to pad, to cushion those areas where we're going to experience more stress. We've even got a little fat there on the pads of our feet a little bit. And so then also, insulation, but protection. I want you to know that adipose in our body is, I'm going to call it over and over, it's liquid-filled bubble wrap. Okay, so it likes to wrap around our organs. We've got subcutaneous fat right underneath our skin that wraps our entire body up and basically acts like bubble wrap right below our skin. So whenever we bump into stuff, we don't just damage our blood vessels and damage our muscles and our bones, right? We don't bruise instantly. And so that adipose is very protective there. Cushioning, protection, insulation, bubble wrap. Okay, now let's move on to proteins. So the third group, we've finished carbs, we've just finished lipids. The third group of organic molecules are proteins. Proteins, they build structure and they create function. And that sounds kind of weird because structure is anatomy and function is physiology, if you remember that. And so when we really think about this class and we really think about these proteins, what we're seeing is that these guys are truly creating our anatomy and our physiology. Much of what we talk about as far as a structure is a protein based with some fat added to it. That's really who we are: muscle, bone, and then we got fat added to it, kind of, So, but protein, so build structure. Give yourself an example. All right, build structure, muscle. Muscle is protein. If you want to eat more protein, then you want to eat more muscle of other animals, right? Eat more meat. Now, as far as creating function, I want you to mention a few things that create functions inside of our body that are proteins. And these things, the first thing is called an enzyme, E-N-Z-Y-M-E, enzymes. So these enzymes, these things catalyze reactions or they make reactions happen when they wouldn't. And so enzymes are really causing chemistry to happen, metabolism, and that's function. Okay. Two other things that we're going to get into later in 210 and in the beginning of 211. At the end of 210, we're going to talk about neurotransmitters dealing with the nervous system. So the nervous system uses these neurotransmitters to control the function of your nervous system. So majorly important neurotransmitters. And then in 211, we're going to start out with hormones dealing with the endocrine system. And so hormones kind of do the same thing. They don't work in synapses, and the nervous system is a little more confined. But this endocrine system works with all the other organs in your body, and it releases chemicals. And there's receptors on a lot of these cells, and so it's going to control the function of a lot of our organs. And together, those two systems, the nervous and the endocrine system, are our main two control systems. So as far as function, I like to always mention enzymes, hormones, and neurotransmitters as three types of chemicals, three types of proteins that are super important for functioning. Now, the other thing that we always mention here is the building blocks. And the building blocks, what creates a bigger protein? Again, building blocks are kind of like beads, and the protein, the carb, these are beaded strands or necklaces. And so each one of these beads for a protein is called an amino acid, right? It's not an iso acid, it's amino acid. It's very mean to its name. All right, bad jokes. Sorry. Did I mention I got a 9-year-old? So I got dad jokes for years. All right, so when we're looking here, this amino acid, these are kind of like these beads. We link them together and we create this beaded strand, which is a bigger protein. Now, again, for proteins, they are similar to phone numbers. However many you have and in what order creates a totally different protein. So you could have as little as 8 to 10 amino acids, and you could have them in different orders, and you could make hundreds of different proteins out of that. But if we increase that and we go to 1,000 different amino acids and we put each one of those in a different order, well, now we can start to make hundreds of thousands of different proteins. And in our body, we can make anywhere from 200 to 500,000 different proteins. That's pretty major. Okay, so these proteins, very important for structure and for function. And these guys are made of amino acids. Something else I want to mention real quick about proteins. Proteins like to be in a very specific range of pH and temperature. Okay, so if you get the temperature of the body too high or too low, then the body stops functioning properly because the proteins, the enzymes, the neurotransmitters, the hormones, they stop working properly. Okay. If you change the pH of the body, if you become too acidic, if you enter acidosis, or maybe too basic, alkalosis, well, then you can also change the function of these proteins and change the function of the entire body. And so that's a bad thing. So proteins like to be in a very narrow range of pH and temperature in order to work properly. In our body, it likes to be around 98.6. And because our body's pH tends to be around 7.35 to 7.45, that tends to be the pH range that most of our proteins like to be in. Okay, so we'll talk about that a little bit further as we get going. The last thing are nucleic acids. Again, this is the last of our organic molecules. We're still on that molecular level. These nucleic acids, these are all specialty molecules. Okay, in other words, each one does something different. So let's talk real quick about the building blocks, and then we will talk about examples. Okay, so the building blocks are of the nucleic acids are nucleotides. 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 These are the smallest components of these nucleic acids. And they're almost kind of like the letter, they look like a big letter L. And we can link all these together and we can build our bigger nucleic acids. Two of these NAs that you may be familiar with are DNA and RNA. So these guys, each one does something different. DNA, if you don't know this, you should know this. DNA is the entire blueprint to build any protein in your body. Okay, so DNA, the entire blueprint to build any code in your entire body, right? So the blueprint for the whole shooting match is in DNA. Now, what RNA does is RNA, if you want to take a note, is simply just a copy of one of the DNA codes for one protein. So RNA is simply just a copy of the code to build only one proteins. So it is not the whole blueprint. It is not big and stored in the nucleus. RNA can leave the nucleus, and it is simply just a copy, and it's only of just one of those proteins. So again, it's different. Now, they still sound similar because they're dealing with this DNA and this protein synthesis stuff. But how about let's mention the third nucleic acid that kind of helps you understand it all, and that is ATP. ATP is biochemical energy, right? So this is the energy that our body uses. Just like in a car, you put gasoline in there, but it's really combustion that makes the tires move, right? Makes the engine work. So same thing, you put glucose in, that's our gas. But then when we combust it, we make ATP. And so that combustion, the actual explosion that causes something to happen, that's a good way to think about it. ATP is that explosion that catalyzes, that really makes something happen. And so here we can kind of see each one of these three, DNA, RNA, and ATP, each one has a very specific function. Nothing else in our body performs that function. And so that's the reason, again, we go back and we say that nucleic acids are our specialty molecules. Okay? Now, let's start with cells real quick, and then we will kind of dismiss a lot of the 210 students. So, cellular level, let's move on to cells, and let's talk just very briefly about cells, and then we'll hit the tissues with 211ers only. So, cells, first off, a cell is the smallest living structure. Some people say it's the smallest unit of life, but no matter what, it's a very small structure, and that it functions on its five. Now, and we are multicellular, obviously, so we're made up of many different cells. When we look at a cell, first off, let's talk about its components. So there are some major components of the cell. I like to list three. Our textbook kind of does a little different, but the first component is the cell membrane. The second component is the cytosol, Cytosol. And the third component are the organelles. Organelles, right? So organ, E-L-L-E-S. So again, let's put a quick definition for each of these. The cell membrane, outer boundary. But really what this is important for is that it controls what enters or leaves the cell. Super duper important. Controls what enters or leaves the cell. And so this cell membrane is made out of fat, right? It's a lot of fat. And so what it does is it pushes water to each side. So it pushes water to the inside. And on the inside, we can do different chemistry with these organelles. And so that's what creates that life, okay? We're doing different chemistry inside this cell membrane, inside of this fat layer, compared to the water that was pushed to the outside of that membrane, the outside of that fat layer. And so now this membrane is truly what helps to create part of this life, separating, creating a different compartment so that we can undergo different metabolism, different chemistry. So cell membrane, super important, controls what enters or leaves. The cytosol, I definitely want you to know, is the inner gooey fluid of the cell. Sometimes this is also called intracellular fluid, or ICF abbreviation. Intracellular fluid, or cytosol, is just the fluid on the inside of the cell, this is where a lot of the metabolism takes place. A lot of the chemistry takes place in this fluid. Metabolism takes place in water. If you don't know that yet, metabolism chemistry, you can't just put two dry chemicals on the table and they react. You have to dissolve them and then they start to react within that water. And so metabolism has to take place inside of water, and most of that water in our body is cytosol, and that's where most of our chemistry takes place. Now, the other structures were called organelles. Again, these are like little organs for the cell, and each one provides a different function for that cell. So let's mention just a few real quick. The nucleus, and we'll go with Mickey Mouse terms, and then I'll tell you the real deal. So a lot of times people Mickey Mouse and call that the brain of the cell, the control center of the cell. But really what the nucleus is, and what I want you to understand, is that's where the DNA is located. DNA is inside the nucleus. And again, DNA is that blueprint to build everything in your body, the structure and all the function. So this is super important that that nucleus contains the DNA, keeps it protected. That's a major function. Okay, if we can trigger the nucleus to become more active or less active, then we are going to change what the DNA is doing. Okay, and that can become very important for our metabolism, for our chemistry, for our endocrine system coming up into 11, for example. Now, next organelle that we can mention is a ribosome. Ribosome, these guys are our protein factories. That's what people usually call them, are protein factories. But I want you to have a better function, a better definition. I want you to know that these ribosomes, this is where amino acids are assembled into proteins. So this is actually where we take those little beads and we make that beaded strand. Okay, so this is where amino acids are assembled into proteins. Now, another structure that I want you to be familiar with is the mitochondria. Okay, the mitochondria is a super important organelle, and we will talk about it over and over. So the mitochondria, a lot of times people Mickey Mouse it and say it's the powerhouse of the cell, right? That's so third grade. Powerhouse. Let's say what it really does. The mitochondria, it uses glucose and oxygen to make ATP. That's what powerhouse is. We need two raw materials. We need sugar, we need glucose, right? And then we need oxygen. Without oxygen, you don't make ATP. Okay? What happens when you don't breathe for 10 minutes? You die. Well, what is death? It's not making ATP. If you stop the cells from making ATP, many times they won't jumpstart back, and that is what death is. Okay? So here we are looking at that mitochondria, very important to get all that ATP to keep that cell functioning properly. Now, the last one I'm going to mention is the Golgi apparatus. Some people say Golgi, G-O-L-G-I, complex or apparatus. What I want you to know about the Golgi is that it processes proteins. This is where we modify proteins to make the final thing that the cell needs, that the body needs. So this is kind of a modification and packaging area, and then it's going to spit out these bubbles called vesicles. And these vesicles can either be used inside the cell or they can be used outside the cell. I want you to know that the Golgi apparatus is also what makes secretions. If we make a vesicle, make a bubble, and we spit it to the outside of the cell, then that's all that a secretion is. Okay, be it saliva, sweat, a neurotransmitter, a hormone, but any type of release to the outside of a cell, more than likely from that Golgi apparatus. All right. So at this point, well, hold on. Two tenors, hold on just a second. Let's go on to tissue. Okay, so there we kind of wrapped up our organic molecules. We talked about the cell real quick. And so now let's move on to tissues. A quick definition of a tissue is a group of cells working together for a common goal or a common function. Okay, so a group of cells working together for a common goal or a common function. And there are 4 types of tissues. So I want you to jot this down. 4 types of tissues. The first is epithelial. The second is connective. The third is muscle. And the fourth is nervous. So again, epi, connective, or I'm going to call it CT. muscle, and nervous. Let's give a quick definition for these, and then I'm going to dismiss the 210ers, and I'll talk about these with the 211ers a little bit. Okay, so with these tissues, first off, epithelial, I want you to know they line and they cover, but they also form glands. So a function of epithelial tissue is it lines and it covers, but it also forms the glands of the body. So epi is what I'm going to call it a lot, and it lines and covers the body, covers the outside, lines the inside, but it also makes your glands. So any of the glands are going to be made out of epi, especially 211ers. Don't forget that, because we are heading into endocrine, where we're going to talk about a bunch of glands. Now, the next is, let's cover muscle next. Muscle, it contracts and produces movement. So pretty simple. Contracts, produces movement. And then the third that we're going to cover is nervous. Nervous system creates and distributes action potentials. So it creates and it distributes action potentials. Now, action potentials, if you haven't heard this term yet in 210, action potentials are the nervous impulses, the electrical impulses that the nervous system uses to cause changes in our body. And so that's the proper term. We're not going to call it, a zap or a signal or something. We're going to use the proper term, an action potential. So that's what that nervous system doing is creating and distributing these action potentials. And I like to call them APs. So you'll hear that term a lot too. Now, if you don't line and cover, if you're not a gland, if you're not a muscle, or you're not part of the nervous system like the brain, the spinal cord, or a nerve, then by default, you are lumped into the connective tissue category. So I kind of pulled that one out. I listed it second, but I covered it fourth, right? And so connective tissue, that's the reason I covered it fourth, is it's the catch-all category. If you're not one of the others, you get thrown into connective. Now, the main function of connective tissue is to connect other tissues together. So that terminology right there is pretty straightforward. We're going to connect other tissues together. But I want you to know that there's three kind of groups of these connective tissues, right? So there are connective tissue propers. These are the guys that actually connect other tissues together. There's supportive connective tissues, things like bone and cartilage that support our body, give us a framework. And then there's fluid or transport connective tissues. And so these fluid transports like blood and lymph, these guys are transporting different molecules and different atoms and elements around our body to keep it functioning and keep it metabolizing and keep us alive. So there's our four major tissues. Okay. At this point, I'm going to go ahead and mention that organs are a collection of tissues working together, okay? And an organ system is a group of organs working together. And then an organism is a group of organ systems working together, okay? So if you're in 210, you can go ahead and review right now. But if you're in 211, hang on for just a few more minutes, and let's go back and let's review our tissues just real quick, okay? So 211ers, let's get going from here forward, and it won't take us but just another 10 or 15 minutes or so. The tissues, don't forget again, we've got epi, CT, nervous, and muscular. So let's talk about these. Epithelial tissue, don't forget, as I've already mentioned, it lines and it covers, and it forms our glands. So when we talk about the lines and the coverings, especially these connective tissue propers, especially these epithelial, sorry, I just mentioned the wrong thing. So we're going to decide these guys, these linings, and coverings, we're going to classify them two different ways based on their shape and based on their layers. So don't forget that. Let's start with the layers first. Remember, we've only got two types of layers. Either that type of epi is simple or it's stratified, right? So simple means it's only one cell layer thick. Stratified means it's more than one cell layer thick. If we think about this, stratified, more than one cell layer thick, well, that's going to be better for protection, right? And then simple, for example, well, that's going to be better for absorbing and secreting, allowing things in and out of the body, all right? So these layers, this is how we describe and how we classify these epithelial tissues, but it's also important functionally. Whenever we see these terms, what are they doing, right? Now, The second thing is based on shape. Okay, so the first shape is squamous. Don't forget that squamous means thin and flat. Okay, whenever we look at it in a microscope, if we looked at it from the side, kind of look like a fried egg. You got the bulging yolk, and then you've got the flattened area around it, right? So these guys, again, if we've got simple squamous, well, that's going to be the easiest to move things through, to absorb and secrete through. But if we've got stratified squamous, well, that can be a super duper thick layer of protection, like the inside of your cheek, right? So very important. Cuboidal is the second type. So cuboidal is the second shape, and cuboidal means cube shape or square. Whenever we look at it, most of our microscope slides, our histographs. And so when we look at these squares, they're about the same height as they are width. A lot of times they're actually hexes. They're not really cubes in the long run if we look at them in 3D. But these guys, these cuboidal cells, especially, we're going to see in 211. When we start to look at endocrine cells, we're going to see that most of our secretory cells, the cells that secrete, our glandular cells, are going to be cuboidal. And so we'll see that. We'll start to see a bunch of cubes making these hormones for our endocrine system. The last type is columnar. And columnar are shaped like columns. They're taller than they are wide, is the key. And again, columnar, good for protection, but also these guys can be important. Simple columnar, for example, in our digestive tract, involved with absorbing nutrients, right? So can be important for a little bit of both. So there we've got our two different layers, simple and stratified. We've got our three different types of shapes, squamous, cuboidal, or columnar. And that's usually how we decide all of our different epis, right? Our different lines and coverings. Now, again, we're about to get into a glandular tissue in 211. And so this glandular tissue is a component of epithelium. So let's don't forget that. And again, a lot of times we're going to see a bunch of these cuboidal cells just kind of clustered together. The next, let's go over muscle real quick. So muscle, don't forget, contract and movement is the two key terms there for its function. Whenever we talk about muscle, we have three main flavors of muscle. Okay, so we have skeletal, we have cardiac, and we have smooth. So the first is the easiest one to target is going to be cardiac. Okay, cardiac refers to your heart, and cardiac muscle is only found in the heart. It is the muscle of the heart that produces the pumps that moves blood through our body. Okay, so cardiac muscle only in the heart, and it pumps blood. Okay, we're going to hit chapter 20 or so in 211, and we're going to find a lot out about that type of muscle. Okay, skeletal muscle we covered in 210 in chapter 10, and so skeletal muscle, remember, one of those tougher topics that we first hit in 210. And skeletal muscle, these guys are attached to the bones, attached to the skeleton. These are the main muscles that people tend to think about. This is what moves us around in our environment, and so skeletal muscle tends to be the main muscle that people really think about when they say muscle. The last flavor is smooth muscle. If you're not attached to a bone or you're not found in the heart, then by default, you're going to be smooth muscle. So anywhere else in the body that we have muscle is going to be smooth. Now, I always like to mention in the walls of tubes, right? Walls of tubes. So that means that this is going to help to control the flow through that tube. Okay. Now, a lot of times we will talk about smooth muscle, for example, in the uterus involved with labor contractions. That's kind of controlling the flow of a baby out, right? The fetus out. But, that's not something that happens every day. Right now, while we're talking, your blood vessels are controlling blood pressure and blood flow by vasoconstriction and vasodilation. And so that's what more we're going to see smooth muscle used for, opening and closing the tubes. If you have a respiratory allergy, something like a food allergy that you eat and then you can't breathe. Well, you're feeling bronchoconstriction. You're feeling the smooth muscle constrict and close off your air passageways, right? So this is the way that I want you to think about smooth muscle, really kind of controlling flow of blood, of air, reproductive part, structures, things like that. And so, if there's a tube in our body, then it's probably got this smooth muscle surrounding it, okay? Nervous tissue. Let's talk about nervous tissue real quick. So this is our third group that we're covering. Nervous tissue, remember, creates and distributes action potentials. Nervous tissue, we talked about it last semester. Remember, CNS versus PNS. The central nervous system is the brain and the spinal cord. And the peripheral nervous system is everything outside of it. And so we like to call that the nerves. But most of this, all of this that's functioning, is due to the neurons. So remember, we got two cell types in our nervous system. We've got neurons, and then we have a second type called neuroglia. Now, the neurons are the functioning cells. So these are the cells that actually produce and distribute action potentials. And then the neuroglia, if you remember, these are just support cells. So they stand around and they help the neurons. The neuron's the driver, and the neuroglia are the rest of the pit crew. They do everything else for the team, but the driver just wants to drive, right? So the neuron just wants to deal with APs while everything else, all the neuroglia, deal with all the rest of the stuff. Okay, so that's a good way to think about it. So this nervous system creating those action potentials, sending those APs, and then causing those effectors to make changes, things like muscles and organs that can make changes. Okay. The last group of tissues is connective tissues. And connective tissues, again, I mentioned it in the quick review of these, that there's three categories of it. So connective tissues, this is the catch-all category, but we divide them up into number one, connective tissue proper, or CT proper. These are the ones that actually connect other tissues together. Okay, if you think back to our first lab from 210 last semester, if it had the word connective tissue on it, then that is a type of CT proper. So loose CT, dense CT, elastic CT, reticular connective tissue. Those are the four main groups or types. Okay. The second grouping of connective tissue are supportive connective tissues. And again, I mentioned this, bone and cartilage are the two main forms of supportive connective tissues. And then the last is fluid or transport connective tissues, and that is blood or lymph. And we're going to get to the blood pretty quick. Second chapter or so, we're going to talk about blood. So we'll look at that, and we'll look especially at how that connective tissue kind of pans out with our comparisons to what we did last semester in connective tissues. Okay. At that point, we've already covered, organs and systems and organisms. I think you guys are good. So for 211ers, this is going to be it for the review. And if everybody stuck around, I hope that this has kind of got you back up to speed and ready to conquer this semester. If you have any questions or comments, shoot me an email, give me a call, something like that. But otherwise, review with this multiple times if you need to, and make sure that you're taking notes. Use this to practice taking notes. I'm moving quickly, so you may need to pause and take a note, maybe go back a little bit and hear it again. But we're going to move kind of quick through this semester. So I definitely want you guys to be prepared for that. So, all right. Can't wait to see y'all in class. Have a great day.